joining us now, Murthy. Mr. Murthy, let me start by asking you about the implications as far as the IT sector is concerned. Now we'll be directly under the gaze of Donald Trump. He's singled out Mexico. He's talked about China specifically. Should the Indian IT industry be worried about President Trump? Because the fear is that he will be more protectionist.
First of all, the Americans have spoken and have elected Mr. Donald Trump as the president-elect. It's, they would have created history if Mrs. Hillary Clinton had been elected the president. But then, that is their democracy. They have chosen. And I congratulate the people of the U.S. In so far as our industry is concerned, I think we have to look at it at the microeconomic level. As I have said many times in the past, our challenge is to make ourselves more and more attractive to our customers by bringing innovation, by working harder, by working smarter. So all that we need to do is to become even more attractive to our American customers. And then I believe that we will continue to grow like we want. So therefore, I see it as a very positive challenge.
Okay, so you're saying that Indian IT needs to become even more competitive. But in the short term, Mr. Murthy, do you expect life for Indian IT companies to become slightly more difficult?
Well, again, it all depends upon what their priorities are and, how they want to handle it. And I'm sure, having been in business, President Trump would also listen to lots of business leaders in the country. And then if we are seen as very critical to the success of the U.S. industry, both in terms of their domestic revenues and in their export revenue, and I'm sure they will factor those pieces of information.
Well, let me also bring in Mukesh Aghi, the president of the U.S.-India Business Council. Mukesh, appreciate you joining us. Under President Obama and Prime Minister Modi, the two countries, that's U.S. and India, have enjoyed a very different relationship. In fact, Richard Verma, the U.S. ambassador to India, has called 2015 the year of convergence and almost a transformational year for India and the US. Do you believe that a change in the White House with Donald Trump coming in will ensure continuity, will continue to build on that momentum?
Absolutely. I think the relationship between the two countries are not tied just between the administrations and Prime Minister and President. It is tied to more common interests, which are long-term, which are strategic and commercial itself. So I believe the relationship will continue moving forward in the right direction.
But what about the fears and the concerns of Donald Trump being more protectionist, about America becoming more insular? While he hasn't sort of singled out India, he's on many occasions publicly spoken about Ford taking its business outside of the US, spoken about Mexico taking jobs, spoken about China taking jobs. In that context, then, what should we truly expect? Do you believe that that was political rhetoric and we will not perhaps see him follow through when we really talk about global trade and renegotiating global trade deals?
Well, there's a big difference between running for election and running a country. I think the political rhetoric will calm down. I believe that his position on TPP and NAFTA has been very negative. His position on Chinese import, where he wants to put almost 35% duty on their goods, I think it will temper down. I think more importantly to understand his challenge, if you look at his vote bank, is white, male, not college educated, who basically feel displaced by the new economy, which is globalized and more tech savvy. So he has to create jobs. And those jobs are not going to be created by putting duties on import of goods. I think what we're going to see is more of a massive fiscal spending where a lot of investments are going to go into infrastructure. That is going to create jobs. And also massive tax cuts where he wants to bring the corporate tax rate down from 35% to 15%. So I think you will see that trend taking place, which does have a one way or other impact in India from a geopolitical perspective.
So do you believe Donald Trump is good for the U.S. economy, Mukesh?
Well, I think depending on what policies they go execute, we still have some time. But I believe that the impact of India's relationship has no impact here. I think he's very pro-business, and I believe he sees India as a good opportunity as a market and a geopolitical partner. So I think the relationship between the two countries will move in an upward trajectory.
Okay, Mukesh Aghi, appreciate you joining us here on India Business Hour with your take on the Trump victory and its implications for the US-India relationship. Also with us, Geeta Gopinath, Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Geeta, appreciate you joining me here on the show. It is Trump in the White House. What does that mean for the US economy? One of the commentators that I was listening into, said that perhaps the media has got it wrong. They took what Trump was saying too literally, while the voters in fact took him seriously. In that context, what should we make of the US economy with Donald Trump in the White House? Do you believe that he will be more protectionist, or do you believe, as Mukesh Aghi just pointed out on the show, that that was a lot of political rhetoric which may not necessarily follow through by way of action?
Firstly, I had to say that this is a huge shock. I mean, I feel like we've woken up to a dystopian nightmare here. The question you asked is a good one about what exactly is he going to do now that he is the president of the United States? Is he actually going to follow through on some of his really outlandish proposals that he had on building a wall and destroying all trade deals? So we'll have to wait and see. I mean, he certainly appealed to voters who were very much in favor of anti-globalization, anti-immigration. So I don't see how he can completely back away from that. I mean, the only hope is that because the Senate, while still Republican control, he doesn't have enough of the numbers there to be able to push anything through. But that said, I mean, there is, as you can see in the markets and you can see in the reaction around the world, there is certainly an expectation of this being bad for the global economy and this being bad for the U.S. economy.
Geeta, Donald Trump has in no uncertain terms said that the Fed was acting in a political way. He's questioned Janet Yellen very publicly. Come December now, how do you think this is going to weigh on the Fed? Do you think the process of normalization will be accelerated, or perhaps it could be the other way around?
On the contrary, actually, I think what's going to happen is that this Fed has been very, very cautious with the data. If there's been any news of turbulence in the markets, in the U.S. markets and the stock markets, they're going to follow these numbers very closely. I think they were cruising towards raising rates, but now I think if anything, they might even actually consider putting a pause on this as we see what happens, how the stock market, where it finally settles, what actually happens in terms of expectations for jobs and trade and inflation going forward. So I don't think so. And I honestly don't think Trump is actually serious when he says that the Fed should be raising rates. Now that he's president, I'm sure he'd be quite happy with keeping rates low.
Right. Let me also bring in Vallabh Bhansali into this conversation. Mr. Bhansali, we've seen what the electoral result has thrown up in the U.S. It's President Trump, or at least President Trump-elect. What do you make of the Trump victory, and what is this now going to mean as far as global equity markets are concerned?
Yeah, the president is always different from the candidate. And this is being borne out here that he has to rule for the next 4 years, hopefully for 8 years. And what he talked on campaign cannot make that happen. So it's politically right, and one has to wait and see that what exactly he does.
I'll come back to you, Mr. Bhansali, in just a second. But Geeta, coming back to you, corporate tax reforms, one of the big highlights of what Donald Trump is promising in his 100-day plan. Do you believe that this will be a big stimulus to the U.S. economy?
Able to push it through, then this is obviously a big deal. I mean, his entire tax plan is quite different from what the Obama administration had pushed through. So this would be a big deal for the economy. I don't necessarily think it's going to be that easy cruising for him once he's actually gets to the job of putting these things in place.
Mr. Bhansali, just going back to the point that you were making, that the presidential candidate and the president is a very different entity. But Trump has managed to garner support, even though some people may consider his views to be extreme on issues like immigration, banning Muslims from entering the U.S., and so on and so forth. Taking a much more conciliatory tone in his speech. But how much of that do you believe is going to be taken forward through the presidency?
You see, when an outsider campaigns in a democracy, they have to be, strident, they have to be take an extreme position to be noticed. And that's how they rally all the extreme elements and bring them, make them mainstream. And so we have seen that kind of thing happen in India or other democracies. So I think it was more a campaigning strategy. There is no doubt that we don't really know Mr. Trump's mind. To that extent, that suspense continues. But I never believed that, he would really carry out what all he said. That's not just possible because he's not a one-man machine. There's a whole government. And we know that even in our own country, that how once you come into the government, there is bureaucracy, there is parliament, there's democracy, media to deal with. So he will have the same speed breakers if at all he intended to carry out whatever he did.
So it may not be that easy for him to follow through with what he promised on the campaign trail, even though the House and the Senate are controlled by the Republicans. But Kunal Bahel, from an e-commerce point of view, you're up against the likes of Amazon, etc. You've got money coming in from the U.S. into Indian e-commerce. What do you make of President Trump and the election that he's driven?
Look, from my perspective, the only thing that matters is President Trump going to be better for India or not? And I actually feel that India's position in today's world is so pivotal and so critical that, especially as a business person, he will absolutely recognize the importance India holds in the global context as well as in the context of the US. So I actually expect him to be relatively forthcoming and quite positively inclined in figuring out how the trade between the US and India can get further enhanced.
Okay, let me bring in Martin Wolf as well. Martin, the markets across the globe have recovered very sharply. They probably believe that President Trump will be very different from candidate Trump, which is the sense that we're getting from our panel this evening as well. You're not convinced of the market's logic, or are you?
I never conclude anything from the stock market about the future of economic policy. The honest truth is, what they've done is perfectly reasonable because they cannot know with any certainty what the effect of these policies will be, and particularly there will no doubt be some sectors that will do very well, some sectors that will be largely unaffected, and some sectors that will do very badly. And at the moment it will be quite difficult to work out which they are. And certainly there are some important economic interests which are not in the stock market or not much affected by what goes on in the stock market. I think we're going to have to work out the implications of these changes for the world economy and thus for the stock values of stocks over quite a long time.
Martin Wolf, the Trump presidency is accompanied by the Republican House and a Republican Senate. Now, what are the implications of that? Because one was anticipating perhaps a legislative logjam, which is exactly what we've seen under President Obama. But given the fact that both the House as well as the Senate are controlled by the Republicans, what do you anticipate?
I think the implications seem to me to be very important, but some of them are not yet certain. But if I just focus on things that have an economic aspect to them, I think they will repeal the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, so that will be gone. They will enact very large tax cuts. Mr. Trump suggested huge tax cuts, but he doesn't want to cut spending, so the American fiscal deficit will get much bigger. He will replace the current chair of the Federal Reserve by somebody who will support his ambition to make the U.S. economy grow 4%. I don't believe the American economy can grow 4%. So if you have a large fiscal expansion and a monetary policy which supports the economy, the likelihood is inflation will rise very quickly, or at least fairly quickly. So I expect us to see an inflationary dollar and a weakening of the external value of the dollar. In this situation, long-term interest rates will rise. This will make it more difficult for the U.S. to manage its debt, and Mr. Trump has already suggested he might default, so you could have a U.S. debt crisis. So, in essence, as a result of their control over Congress, in addition to this, as I've already said, they're likely to repeal Dodd-Frank, which will mean the elimination of much of the regulatory structure for the financial system, and I've already discussed trade policy. In all of this, the Congress will probably largely support him, so this will be a very, very big shift in the American economic policy environment.
Well, you're absolutely right about that, because he has promised looser regulations, and doing away with Dodd-Frank is something that he has promised. But, you know, from an emerging market point of view, and we've discussed the whether the slant is going to be protectionist or not, but from an emerging market investor point of view, what should they be worried about?
Well, as I said, there's going to be, I believe, a lot of instability and a lot of uncertainty. So they have to look at the exposure of businesses to and of economies to the U.S. economy, to the dollar, and to American interest rates. And they have to be very selective, I think, in this environment, looking to the economies that are relatively less vulnerable to trade shocks, maybe economies that will benefit from an American trade war with China, which is quite plausible, likely event. Look at stocks of companies which are oriented predominantly to the domestic economy. This is going to be an era of shock, so they're going to have to be also quite conservative in their approach.
All right, we will leave it there. Martin Wolf, Geeta Gopinath, Hena Narayanamurthy, Mukesh Aghi, Kunal Behel, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18 as we decode the Trump victory and what it means for the U.S. economy and for India and the United States. Now, Trump